Hi, are you interested to learn about how to develop apps for multiple platforms with Xamarin.Forms? Me and Johan Karlsson has written a book about it. The name is Xamarin.Forms Project and published by Pact. First, you'll get an introduction to Xamarin and how to set up and develop a machine. When you are ready to start develop, we will guide you through 7 projects. It will start with a project where you will learn all the basics of Xamarin.Forms, and we will continue with more advanced stuff. For example, how to access platform-specific features, location tracking in the background, real-time communication with Signal R, augmented reality, and machine learning. Hi, and welcome to the second episode of App in the Cloud. And today I will say welcome to my guest, David Ortinau. He's working as a program manager for Xamarin.Forms, but I will let him introduce himself. Welcome, David.
Hey, Daniel. Glad for being here, man. So I am a program manager for Microsoft, working on all the Xamarin mobile SDKs, specifically Xamarin.Forms, since that's where the majority of our user base is. But it also covers the underlying iOS and Android SDKs, as well as components. And, there's many other program managers that we all work together as a team. So, it's a team effort. I don't want to take credit for all the wonderful things that are happening.
So what are you doing in your role as a program manager?
So what a program manager does is we primarily are talking to customers to find out what they're struggling with, what they need.
Okay, sounds like an interesting job. How long has you been in that role at Microsoft? Do you join before the acquisition of Xamarin, or do you join after it?
Yeah, so I joined afterwards. Before I was an MVP. So I was actually in the first round of MVPs that Xamarin put out. And then I joined about 2 years ago, which was about 2 years after the acquisition. So the whole Xamarin organization within Microsoft was fairly new to Microsoft processes. And, one of the wonderful things about the way Microsoft has been doing acquisitions, as you can see with GitHub right now, is they don't really, run in and try to make a bunch of changes. They let the leadership do what the leadership has been doing there. Of course, they brought in Nat Friedman to head up what GitHub is doing, but what has been successful for those companies in the past, the same thing happened with Hockey App. They let that continue and bring value where they can to process and to roles and to things like that. So in the 2 years that I've been with Microsoft, we've certainly started to adopt more and more of the processes and the learnings that Visual Studio and the whole developer division has been successful with. I mean, you look at the meteoric rise of Visual Studio Code. You look at what's happened with Visual Studio itself. It's growing at an incredible rate, and that's very much in part due to the processes and the way that we go about learning from customers and implementing those things in the process. So Xamarin as an org within Microsoft has certainly made quite a bit of change over the past couple of years, and all for the better. And we're starting to really see a lot of that reward in the quality of the products, faster build times, new IDE enhancements, a lot closer integration with all the pieces. XAML IntelliSense still has a ways to go, but is much improved from where it was. The new advancements in IntelliCode using AI in the cloud to enhance your C# and your XAML. It's pretty amazing. Been there for 2 years. Before that, for about 10 years, I had my own company doing mobile application development and web development for about 10 years. And then for about 15 years before that, worked in a variety of markets, including advertising, creative, did a little bit of game stuff, did quite a bit of healthcare stuff, which was not the most exciting thing, but, all very good experiences to have. And all hopefully helps me be a better program manager, because I can better understand the stuff that you and other developers deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, so when do you start developing with Xamarin and Xamarin.Forms?
So
I guess it was before you joined Microsoft, because you say it was one of the first Xamarin MVPs. So that's cool.
It was before, and so I was doing. Well, I started with mobile when the first iOS SDK came out, so I wasn't doing any of the really early like Windows Mobile stuff, or even any of the early Java stuff. But when the first iOS SDK, or I guess what did they call it back then, the iPhone SDK, when that came out, I started getting into Objective C. I didn't know anything about Objective C, so kind of the way that I have learned. And backing up even further, I have an English degree. So I went to university to study literature and communication, which is probably why I talk so much. And so computers and computer science and technology for me was really a hobby passion, which I don't think is terribly uncommon. I think a lot of us are self-taught programmers. But that was my path. And so I paid a guy a great developer in Chicago to help me build an Objective-C iOS app. And so he did the first run at it. And after about, I don't know, maybe it was a year of that, I took over the application. And that's how I taught myself, with his help, Objective-C. And then at some point, I was talking to another .NET developer because I had done a bunch of ASP, VB script, Access Database, SQL Server stuff. That was kind of what I had been doing before that. And so I loved C# because I made that transition from VB script to VB.NET to C#. And I really liked it. I did not like web forms. Probably the way I was doing it, I don't know. It just got really cumbersome and slow. So all my web stuff moved to Ruby on Rails, and then eventually a little bit of PHP I was forced to do. But anyway, so that's a little bit of a scattered history for me. But I had a guy that I was doing a little bit of work with, and he was like, "Hey, have you heard of this monotouch thing? You like C#, you're doing mobile development. You would probably like this monotouch thing." And I'm like, "Well, I've never heard of it. What is it?" And he starts telling me about this alt.NET movement. It's not necessarily within Microsoft, but it's .NET developers who still love the technology and are doing these really crazy things with it. And so I looked at monotouch, and I don't even remember if I actually fired up anything initially, but it kind of just sat there for a while. And then eventually I was like, you know what, I'm going to give this a shot. So because I was running my own company and customers came to me and trusted me to choose the technology I was using, I was able to start doing projects with monotouch and monodroid. And then Xamarin became its own company pretty shortly thereafter, if not right at the same time, and then rebranded everything as Xamarin. So it was kind of around that time. It was before it was called Xamarin, but very quickly became Xamarin. I think at that time, maybe the namespaces were still monotouch and monodroid for a while, before they unified everything and whatnot. So
you can still see that in some places.
Yeah, it still exists. It's it's hard to erase every memory of that sort of thing, and who would want to? I mean, that's a great history. It goes back for a long time.
So let's talk about Xamarin.Forms. I guess you was pretty early to test that as well, and what was your first experience with Xamarin.Forms?
So because I was part of we had an insiders program in the early days of Xamarin. It's no longer a thing. But it was a program that some of us MVPs and others, key customers, were invited to participate in, and we would get early access to some of the experiments. So I remember this thing coming through to my email, Quick UI. And I was doing, Xamarin iOS and Xamarin Android. I was doing almost exclusively cross-platform, because even if a customer said, "Hey, we just want iOS first," they wanted to eventually go to Android. So of course, I was using Xamarin to be able to do that with really good success. For some very big customers, if I named them, you would recognize the names. But so I saw this Quick UI thing through the Insider program, and I took a look at it, and I was kind of like, okay, I see where they're going with it, and it's interesting, but I personally am very productive in doing iOS nib, interface builder type stuff, and I'm totally fine with the Android XML, and I'll occasionally open the Android Designer, and I'm proficient with that. So I don't really see a huge benefit for my work in doing Quick UI. So I kept an eye on it. It became released as Xamarin.Forms. I remember being at Evolve when it was released, and people went bananas for it. And I was frankly kind of rolling my eyes like, what? I mean, yeah, it's cool, but this didn't just revolutionize the world or anything. But then again, I was not, I hadn't done WinForms, WPF, Silverlight stuff. And I think this was on the trajectory that people wanted to see with Xamarin, and it really connected with their history and their experience with those technologies. And so they were very excited to see this introduction. And it wasn't too long after the whole thing was created that XAML was a part of the whole story. So I think that really resonated with a lot of people, but it didn't with me. So I was not completely skeptical that Xamarin was doing anything ridiculous, but it just wasn't for me. So I had subcontractors that were working for me, and they were kind of doing some other projects, because they were just subcontractors. So they had other projects that weren't mine. And I would occasionally ask them, hey, how's the Xamarin.Forms thing coming along? I saw that a new version dropped. Is it any better? Is it more stable? Is the performance getting any better? That sort of thing. When do you think it's going to be ready to use in production apps? And eventually, somewhere around 2.0, I guess, they said, hey, yeah, I think it's actually quite good now. We feel productive and happy with the experience. You should give it a look. So I had a customer who wanted to do a mobile cross-platform app, and so I bid them two quotes. One quote was Xamarin iOS and Xamarin Android with unique UIs for each, and the other was Xamarin.Forms. And to make it attractive to them and to give myself a project to learn Xamarin.Forms on, I bid it a little bit cheaper. And of course, they went with a cheaper bid. And so I was able to do a Xamarin.Forms project, and it worked out really well. I was quite happy with it. I didn't know XAML, but I had done MXML with Adobe Flex, and it was not too dissimilar. I had also done one or two Silverlight. Well, I can't say I did the project end to end, but it was one of those things where you come in late to try to fix something for somebody and make it all work. So I had some experience with XAML. I wasn't totally ignorant of it. And I had done a little bit of Windows Phone messing around. Actually, come to think of it, I did actually do a store app for Microsoft through an agency that I was working with. It was just a prototype demo thing when Windows Phone was very first a thing. It was meant to be one of their showcase apps, sample apps. So yeah, that was my first experience with Xamarin.Forms. It was a good experience, but it wasn't necessarily something I was fully committed to, even when I started using it. It was more of a thing that I could be productive in, and customers liked the results. But if I really needed to get down to the nitty gritty stuff, I would just go to the iOS and the Android native bits. But that's also one of the wonderful things about Forms, right? Is you don't have to do everything in the Forms layer. You absolutely can get down into iOS and Android, custom renderers, effects, platform specifics, if you want to. Yeah. But of course, the direction that we're trying to go with Xamarin.Forms right now, and the feedback that we continue to hear is, while that's wonderful and nice, if we don't have to, and we can be more productive just staying in the Xamarin.Forms space, don't make us go make custom renders for things. So that's kind of the whole F100 thing, and that's really paid off big time. People are loving that. I don't know, what's your experience been with the F100s and things like that? Have you been using any of the new properties and features that we've added over the past year?
Yeah, of course, using all of the new features. In the beginning, it was a lot of custom renderers and platform-specific things, but I thought that was okay, because I think it depends very much on what approach you had to Xamarin.Forms. For me, it was a framework that helped me to share some code in places where I can do it, and if I have to do platform-specific things, that was not a problem for me. But I think many people that started with Xamarin.Forms thought that they could do everything shared between the platforms, and they was not open to do platform-specific things. So, but if you compare to projects that we did for a couple of years ago, we have about maybe 20 custom renders. Now we maybe have 2 instead. So
yeah, I mean, that's
to accomplish the same things.
Yeah, that's very much my perspective as well. But that's also given our background and our history with the iOS and the Android SDKs and those UI kits, that we understood well what those platforms did and how they differed from each other. So The great thing about Xamarin, and we definitely believe in this, is that we're never going to prevent you from getting to those lower layers to be able to do the things you need to be able to do. But anything we can help you to do more of in the Xamarin.Forms area to create less custom renderers when you don't have to, we're certainly going to do that. I mean, I've seen some examples where people were creating custom renderers just to amend one property of a UI text field, for example. And that's just really sad, right? It's like, man, that's at least 2 classes and a bunch of code just to be able to tweak one line. So anything we can do to help prevent doing that and improve productivity, we're going to work on.
And I think you have done a great job with it. As you mentioned, since 2.0, there are big difference in both what you can do and if you talk about performance. So in one of the earliest apps I built, the biggest problem was the performance of list views. Every list view we have in the app, at least on Android, we had to build custom renderers, but we rebuilt that app, and I'm still working with it. And then now with all list views is Xamarin.Forms list views without any performance issues. So that's really
no,
great.
That's amazing to hear. Yeah, list views tends to. I mean, most every app has one, and it can get really complicated depending on what you're trying to do and how you implement that UI. So, speaking of what's coming up in Xamarin.Forms, we have the new collection view, which that name is still a little bit up in the air. There's some discussion as to whether that's the right name, if it's too confusing with a UI collection view that you get in iOS, even though that is the native control being used. But right now it's called Collection View, and really it's going to drastically, we think, improve the performance of lists. You can do not only vertical lists, but you can do horizontal lists, you can do grids. And then you also have the option of very easily plugging in your own custom layouts. And then it also introduces empty views. Of course, it has pull to refresh, it has swipe gestures, it has single and multiple item selection, all the things that you would need and expect from a modern list view. And on iOS and Android, it's using the very latest controls. But probably for performance, the biggest thing that Collection View does is it no longer depends on view cells. So in list view, every cell is wrapped in a view cell. So you get this duplication of wrappers everywhere. And that can really hinder performance when you're scrolling, when you're rendering long lists and that sort of thing, even when you're using recycling. So Collection View no longer depends upon that, and we haven't done full benchmarking on everything yet because it's still very much in development, but very much looking forward to seeing the final benchmarking. The initial benchmarks do look promising, but we haven't published anything about that. When we do have something really good to show, I'll make sure to blog about it and show how the performance is improved.
Okay, but is the plan that the collection view should replace list view, or will they live side by side? Mm-hmm. I guess they will do for a long time because of backward compatibility. But collection view will be the one you recommend for new development when you have a stable release of Xamarin.Forms that includes it.
Exactly. As soon as it's stable and ready to go, it's going to be our recommended approach. And list view will be there for backwards compatibility for legacy applications. Of course, we'll do the best that we can to provide guidance on how you can convert your list view implementations to collection view, so you can benefit from the newer bits and phase out those old things. But at this point, we're not going to rip out list view by any means. Backwards compatibility, making sure we take care of the people who've invested in Xamarin for years and years and years. At this point, we're not going to cut them off at the knees. List view is still going to be there, but we got to keep marching forward as well. So, collection view will certainly be the recommended approach.
Okay, and maybe there you will focus your development as well with improvements and optimizations in the future versions as well.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the issues that are filed right now against Xamarin.Forms, I haven't run an analysis lately, but there is a large segment that are list view related issues that they're hard to solve, but they're pretty pervasive. So, as we are investing in collection view, those list view, it's kind of going to get frozen in time, right? It's going to be what it is. And if you're dealing with an issue, we are investing in collection view, and that's where you should go to get the latest improvements, as well as any fixes for things that you're dealing with in a list view.
In the beginning of Xamarin.Forms, not you, but Xamarin talked a lot of the table view. Is this still in Xamarin.Forms? I never heard anyone use it anymore. But but I know Jason Smith said once it was terrible if you talk about performance, so he wants to rip it out.
Yeah.
But I guess it's hard to do that as well. So.
It still exists. When you hear people, Jason or anybody else, talking about, hey, we're going to rip this out of Xamarin.Forms because it's a performance issue or it's just a nightmare to maintain, that doesn't necessarily reflect whether or not it's getting used. When we hear feedback that performance is a concern and then customers share their applications with us, certainly there's things that we can and should be, and we are working on within Xamarin to improve the performance of whether it's a control or the startup time of your Android applications or the rendering performance of your application when you go from view to view. There's also a lot of just, mistakes that we as developers make until we learn better. Sometimes it's deeply nested views where we have too many views on the screen at once, not properly using caching, image caching, asset caching, any of those sorts of things. But also, table view. I mean, if you abuse a table view, it's not going to perform as well as other methods of doing things. I'm not entirely sure where the performance problems with table view come from, or I shouldn't say problems. They're limitations of that type of control. It's not optimized for performance, for large data sets, for rendering large things. So it certainly does still exist. I think that there is some feeling with themes and data pages are also other really good examples where we don't have a lot of evidence that a lot of customers are using those features, but they're still sitting there, right? So should we invest in them? Should we deprecate them? Are they doing any harm just by existing? It's certainly code that needs to be maintained and paid attention to. If it exists still. So those are the questions that we wrestle with and that the engineering team in particular wrestles with. And they'll occasionally ask me, hey, can we rip this out? And so then I need to go back to all of our data and our customers and developers and say, are you using this? Because we don't know, right? Like, I don't know how many buttons are in your application. There's no way for me to know that. And, a lot of that's privacy related, right? We're not going to go in and analyze your code. Yeah. Because we're very sensitive and aware that we don't have the right to do that. So unless you share it with us, I have no idea what controls you're using. So how often does a table view get used? No clue. I hope it's not too much.
I think I never have used it.
You've never? Yeah.
Not for real, at least. But the main reason is the lack of binding.
Yeah. I mean, the binding is a key part of most applications, and when you don't have it, you're not going to use the control. I think where table view is interesting is a lot of customers who come from a web background. They're used to using tables to do certain layout. And so they come in and they look at the components that we have, and they see a table view, and they're like, oh, I know that from my web days. I'm going to use that, right? But yeah, it's not necessarily the best way to do a mobile application. So it exists. Use it or don't. It doesn't really matter to me.
Yeah. When we're talking about bindings, one thing that I love with the 3.5 release is the bindable layout. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely. So, there's been demand and cries from the developer community for a long time for some kind of a repeater view, recycler view, not necessarily recycler, but repeater view in particular, an items view where it's lesser than a list view, but still provides that binding capability to take a data set of something and iterate over it and put it on the screen, right? So I proposed a repeater view I use something that Shane Newville, who's on our engineering team now, had written and posted a gist of before he joined Microsoft. And it essentially took a stack layout and made a repeater view out of it. And there were several others out there from other people. I think some of our component vendors might have even had something and might still. But when
I think that's something that you will create in each project you're doing. Every app will have a repeater view based on stack layout or even on flex
exactly.
layout.
I kept copying it from project to project. And when you have something like that, we certainly need to raise that up as a request on our GitHub and have a discussion about it. If it's something that you're copying over from project to project, maybe it's something that needs to be in Xamarin Essentials if it's a non-UI but cross-platform thing. We also have the Xamarin Community Toolkit, which James Montemagno is working on improving and hopefully getting some adoption for. Maybe it's something that belongs in there, or maybe it's something that belongs in Xamarin.Forms itself. But until we get those things up on specs and we kind of open up the discussion on them, we don't know. So that's what happened with the repeater view. The discussion opened up, and as we were talking about it and how it would work, I guess the idea, I don't remember even who initially proposed it. It's on GitHub, so I'm sure we could find out. But the bindable layout I guess it's really a XAML extension, right? Extension method. You can take that bindable layout and decorate any layout with it and turn it into a bindable. Of course, the key distinction between a bindable layout done that way and a list view is you have no item recycling. So it's good for small data sets, stuff that is going to be rendered once, probably, although you can do, I guess, multiple binding, two-way bindings and things like that. But it's extremely flexible. I use it a lot with flex layouts. I went immediately, as soon as it became a thing, I went immediately to my old Conference Vision Microsoft app that I showed off at Build last year, that I had done that exact repeater view thing with a bunch of flex layouts. And I immediately ripped that out, put flex layout in there, and added my bindable layout attributes to it. And it was an easy update, man, and it works great. It's awesome.
It's a small thing, but it makes the development so much easier. You don't have to handle the data template rendering or everything like that, and handle the events of the observable collections and so on.
Yeah, I find that it's the little things like that really tap into what helps make us the most productive. Like, I don't know if you've noticed that the new on-platform inline syntax that Daniel Casalino added for us. But you, rather than having, 10 lines of XAML code with on-platform, on iOS, on Android, and all that jazz, right inside your binding syntax, you can have an on-platform with a default and a value fallback and everything you need. It's just such a nicer syntax, in my opinion, to be able to do that.
I suggested a couple of years ago to do that as a binding extension, and that's why you introduced it in some of the versions as well. But it was not that good on open source in the beginning. I think there was a lot of confusion where to propose things, and you have the mailing list, and you have the forum, and you have GitHub and things like that.
But it's clear now, right?
I think so. I don't know if you're still using the forum so much, or everything's based on GitHub.
It's all GitHub for us.
Tell us the process.
It's all GitHub for us. The forums are really still there at this point for the community and for the history that's there to be able to look up things. So it's mostly community members talking to community members. We'll occasionally get called in to answer a question here or there. Of course, if you tag us, we get alerted. But it's not, it's not a support forum. It's not a place where we monitor as closely as we used to, because now that we're inside Microsoft, there's a whole different channel to be able to get your support requests and things like that answered. So yeah, we don't spend much time in the forums. Any requests, any conversations that want to be had with the team, GitHub is the place to be.
Okay, so let's talk about Xamarin.Forms 4. I think Shell is one of the biggest new features. Can you tell us about it?
So, as we were looking at not only new customers coming in to learn Xamarin.Forms, but also what people were doing on a repetitive basis with the navigation, with the structure of their applications, and just take 20 of any Xamarin.Forms applications and look at them. What are the most common things people are doing, and how can we help improve that whole process? We came up with this concept of Shell. It was something that was proposed by one of the Microsoft fellows, I believe was his title. And he says, hey, you guys should really look into this. I think this would be a wonderful addition to Xamarin.Forms. And so Miguel inspired us to go look into this, and Jason put together a spec. And essentially what Shell allows you to do is very easily describe the pages of your application. And based on the hierarchy of how you describe it, iOS and Android will render out the appropriate navigation UI. And it provides some other benefits as well. So there is integrated search handling on pages that have lists, so you don't have to write a bunch of UI code and filtering code necessarily to be able to do common things like that. You get some of the animations of the search box and the buttons and the cancel and all that stuff in and out of your navigation space for free. You get a sidebar menu, which we call a flyout. With a hamburger, you get all that for free.
Yeah, that could be a little bit complicated with the master detail page to handle the navigation if you have that. So I think that's great that you.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the default template that we generate when you want to do a master default, you've got a couple of view models, a couple of page, XAML pages, and communication flying all over the place just to make all that stuff work. And with Shell, it's really dead simple. So the flyout is very flexible in that you can customize several pieces of it. It's all templatized. And if you want to go beyond what the templates provide to you, and I'm really liking from a productivity standpoint how I can easily provide a data template to the menu item renderers, the shell item renderers, the flyout header template renderer. I can just easily describe those data templates inline in the shell file or as a separate XAML file. And I don't have to go down to the native code necessarily to get that stuff done, which is great. The other thing you can do once you get beyond what a data template will allow you to customize in Shell is there's basically just one shell item renderer that you override in your native projects. And when you override that, you get access to everything that Shell is controlling for you. So that's the flyout, that's the top tabs and bottom tabs, that's the Shell context itself. So, in the end, it's still a Xamarin.Forms application. Everything that you have, your content pages, your custom controls, your content views, everything is all still the same. It's really just, it's kind of like taking your master detail or taking your tabbed page and ripping that out and putting it in a shell. Let's see, what else can I talk about? Oh, so it's kind of built async from the start. So when you describe all your content within the shell file, you're going to do it all as data templates. So that means that we will only create them and load them when they're needed. So your startup of your application will be improved based on that. If you do want to go ahead and start up your application and have everything pre-rendered, you don't have to use data templates. You can just declare them directly. But that's a choice that you have to make, and you will know that you have done this, and the performance implications hopefully will be obvious to you when you do it. So within Shell, and this is something that's going to take a little bit of learning, but it doesn't take long. There's really 3 levels of hierarchy. And iOS and Android, based on the way the design systems work on iOS and Android, the top level navigation is typically a side menu flyout. Sometimes it's a bottom tab, but when you have a flyout, your secondary navigation is the bottom tabs, and then your third level of navigation becomes top tabs. So that's the way that we've implemented Shell. It is biased in that direction, but it is informed by the design systems from Apple and from Google. So if you only want to have bottom tabs, you absolutely can do that. And there are samples out there that we've been publishing that demonstrate how to achieve that. If you only want to have top tabs, you can achieve that as well. Or if you want to use all 3 systems of navigation, Shell will do that by default. The interesting thing here for me is that you're responsible for describing the hierarchy of your application, and Shell takes over how it's going to render the UI for you. So in the future, let's say that Xamarin.Forms extends Shell to support UWP or to WPF or to Linux or to WebAssembly or to some device that we've not yet seen, which I'm not prophesying anything. I don't know of any devices we haven't seen, but at some point, somebody's going to introduce something. The interesting thing about Shell is that it can accommodate all of that. And the hierarchy of your application is unlikely to change just because you have a new device. You might change how much content, responsive design on mobile devices kind of taught us that the same content and features that a browser can handle is probably not what you're going to put into a mobile experience. But Forms can already handle that, and Shell, with no modification, would be able to handle all those different platforms. And I think that's just really crazy cool. And it's something that really kind of dawned on me as I was going through the first exploration of building my own Shell applications, converting some of my existing applications over to use Shell. I was really starting to feel that power and flexibility for what I would be able to do with this thing in the future. And of course, I was immediately more productive than when I was using tabbed pages and master detail pages. And so another thing, and I know I'm going kind of long here, but probably the top thing that people are very excited about in Shell, and I probably should have mentioned at the very beginning, is the new navigation service. So you can use the old existing navigation service, of course, but we have a new URI-based navigation service that makes it really powerful to be able to jump to any part of your application at once. You can go deep into your navigation stack and not inflate all the views. You can jump forwards and backwards. And it's available everywhere. You don't have to worry about nesting pages within navigation pages. As long as your application is hosted within a shell, navigation is ubiquitous. It's available everywhere in your application, and you should never get bitten by a runtime error that says, "Hey, navigation is null." So that's a big one that
Okay.
when we tested this concept with a bunch of developers, that was almost always at the top of the list of benefits that people were really excited to see. Yeah, so Shell does a lot more. I could go on and on and on, but those are really the key things that I think people are going to initially be really excited about. And I don't know when this will be shipping, but we are actually working on some naming changes within the shell file. As I mentioned, there are 3 levels of hierarchy. There's the shell item, shell section, and shell content. We have a concept of unifying those names, and just the hierarchy of how you nest them is what makes a difference. So I think that will be cleaner. It also creates a bit of separation between how the UI is rendered and how you describe your content. We'll see if that resonates with people when we release that preview, hopefully within the next week or 2 from today.
Okay, interesting. I will have a talk in 2 weeks about the news in Xamarin and Xamarin.Forms. So you, I maybe have to change my preparations in the last.
It shouldn't be too difficult for you, but
Okay,
if by the end of this week I have something to share with everybody, then you'll be able to get that into your presentation easily.
Okay, sounds great. But how stable do you think Shell is right now? If someone will start to build a new app, should they use Shell or should they wait? My experience is that it's maybe not that stable right now, and there are a lot of bugs and issues.
Yeah. I mean, all you have to do is go to GitHub issues, right, and filter on the Shell label, and you'll see that there are quite a few bugs. So I would wait if you can wait. I would definitely encourage people, though, to still explore it. It's super easy to set up and then to remove, because really it's just one file. It doesn't have to be one file. You can split it up and everything, but really it can be just one file that you add as your main page in your application. So very easy to get up and try it out. And if you feel like it's not ready yet for you and for your application, you can just comment it out and go back to using master detail, tab pages, and the other navigation that you were using before. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely a list of bugs that need to be worked through, but I don't think that any of them pose significant risk. I mean, most of them can be worked around. Some of them are frustrating. Some of them are missing gaps in what I hope the final product is. But again, this is just the first version of Shell. There are other pieces of this that we want to see, such as screen-to-screen transitions, declarative segues in XAML for navigation purposes, all kinds of things like that. So there's plenty more to be done for sure, but we are still shooting for a stable release of the first version of this by mid to late March. That's all depends on how stable it is, and if it's not ready to go, then we'll hold it. We've got time. We don't want to put something out there before it's ready. We're not going to get overly excited about it, because really the stability and the performance and the confidence that the community has in Xamarin is more important to us than shipping a new feature.
Okay, so if you will build a bigger app that maybe not will be released in the next month, you recommend to start investing heavily in Shell. But if you will release in 1 or 2 months, you maybe should build it the old way.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, but also you need to kind of look at Shell and evaluate it and see if it does meet the needs of your application. It's probably not for every application, but I would definitely guess that it solves most people's needs for most applications that I have seen built in Xamarin.Forms. So it's certainly worth evaluating, but I think you're absolutely right. If your application is not launching for 3-4 months, or you've got maybe a year ahead of you, it's worth adopting it now if it's the right thing for your application.
Okay, so the plan is not that Shell is the new that everyone should use it. You should always evaluate what is your best approach to this.
We need to see what the feedback is. I am certainly going to be recommending it as a default starting point. Because again, it's super easy to switch if it doesn't meet your needs, but it provides so much more convenience and benefit that it's hard to see many situations where it wouldn't be the right choice. But that's a learning that we need to get. We need to learn that from you, the developers, from our customers, and find out if we're right about that. And the only way to find out if we're right is to put this thing out there and see what the usage is. So. We can't necessarily see the future, and we certainly don't see every single app that somebody makes with Xamarin.Forms. So we take the position that we are going to learn, and as we learn, we'll adjust.
A really good approach of it.
Now, it would be wonderful to stand up and say we know everything, but we've learned better.
One of the other new things I read about is the Carousel View. I think you have tried a couple of times to integrate the Carousel View in some way in Xamarin.Forms, but now is the plan to implement it in the Xamarin.Forms core, or should it be an extra NuGet packages as it with the last one, or what's the plan?
It will be integrated in Xamarin.Forms core. We have a prototype of it that is in Xamarin.Forms for preview now, and we're finalizing or kind of iterating on that specification right now on GitHub. So Rui on our engineering team has put up a spec, and we have been discussing what the Carousel View needs to be able to handle. We're also looking at the existing Carousel View plugin that we published way back at Evolve something, Evolve 3 maybe, and making sure that we can be as close to that API as possible. I was just looking at some NuGet numbers, and that Carousel View is crazy popular. It is in a lot of projects, and which is no big surprise. I've known since I started working with Microsoft that the Carousel View was a hot topic. So It'll be in the main, in the core project for a couple of reasons. One is for performance. Not only the performance of the carousel view itself, but the performance of applications in general, because the more we can reduce the number of NuGet packages people depend upon to do their applications, the faster your startup times will be, the faster your applications will be, your build times, et cetera, et cetera. So it's useful whenever we can to have things within Xamarin.Forms. But of course, that can potentially bloat things. So we haven't talked about visual yet, but that's something that we're being very cognizant of. We're being very aware of with visual, is that we're introducing a whole dependency on Google's material library. And if you don't want to use material on iOS, we don't want to make your IPA or your application, several megabytes bigger, whatever that payload happens to be. So we're taking that into account, and we have some strategies to reduce the application size if you don't want to use material. But you will be opting into it when you do that. So the same thing goes for Carousel View. So from a progress standpoint, we are still working on the spec, and we will begin doing serious development on it very soon. Again, we do have the prototype, so we have some things done. And the really great thing about it, which hopefully makes things go fairly quickly, is that it is based on the collection view work. So the same base classes, items view that supports collection view will support carousel view. So a lot of the work is already done. So when we do have a stable release of that and we publish that, we will deprecate and archive the existing Carousel View plugin. We'll make sure that existing applications that still depend on being able to get that NuGet will still be able to get it, but we will highly recommend that everybody transition over to the new Carousel View. And I should mention, you kind of alluded to, we've been trying to get a carousel view merged in for quite a while. And there were some community contributions that were offered to get carousel view in. And I was excited to work with those developers. And for various reasons, it just didn't work out. And so that was a bummer. I was hoping that we would be able to get some of those popular contributions in there. But I think in the end, with what we're doing with collection view and items view, this is going to be a better solution for you, and certainly a better solution for our development team, because they can maintain a more coherent, cohesive code base instead of trying to marry up a couple of different things. So I'm very excited to see it. I've put together tons of samples of really cool carousels that I think we should be able to handle by default without a lot of effort. And so I think I'm very optimistic that what we are able to deliver for Carousel View is going to excite and surprise a lot of developers.
It looks really interesting, and for me it will be great because in the app I'm building right now we have a lot of different carousels.
Yeah,
so,
it's a popular control.
And I think we're using that one that you tried to merge into Xamarin.Forms right now, because it was an own product before, or an own library, maybe a better word than product. But
yeah, and there's several other carousel views out there that are variations of Alex Rainman's carousel view, and they kind of just add on to it and tweak a few things. So it's a testament to how well he has done that product. He did a great job with it, and we wouldn't be here today with all the carousel views in Xamarin.Forms applications if he hadn't done that. So I think Carousel View wouldn't be probably nearly as popular today had he not done all the wonderful work that he did. And so it's a great testament to him. And I'm excited that we're going to be able to contribute our own Carousel View here soon, that hopefully people will be very excited about and get lots of good use out of.
I'm really excited about it, at least. So are there any other big things that is worth mentioning about Xamarin.Forms 4?
Yeah, so I think I alluded to it a little bit ago. I mentioned visual, and so what visual allows you to do is more easily create a consistent look to your and feel really and behavior to your mobile application between iOS and Android. We've received a lot of feedback that a lot of the applications that you're building, upwards of 90% of the applications that developers build cross-platform need to be nearly or exactly the same on iOS and Android. And so Visual is a attempt to help you out with that. A lot of customers feel like they can do it on their own with styles, but we have certainly heard from others that styling that much can be difficult. So what Visual does is you can declare the visual material style at the top of your application. And we started with material because it is the most popular starting point. And that's the feedback that we got from the developers we talked to about this. And it will style all the controls that are available in material throughout your application. And then you will get a consistent, or at least a more consistent, iOS and Android experience by default. So the amount of styling that you have to do from that point should be much less than if you had started as you do today without material, where your iOS today and your Android today look completely different. Now, some people might say, okay, well, this sounds just like themes. Why isn't this just a theme? Well, like I said, it's not just the look, it's also the behavior. Material describes not only how controls look, but also how they behave. Entry is a really good example, right? Where you have a placeholder and that as you type in it, that placeholder moves to be just above the entry field. And other controls have touch interaction with the ripple that you see and things like that. So Visual actually goes beyond just styling existing renderers, and in some cases modifies the renderer, and in other cases provides a completely separate material renderer to replace the existing renderer. And so here's one of the really cool, powerful things about it is that you get to opt in and out of Visual as you choose. So if you're comfortable with Visual and it matches what your designer gave you or what your goals are, then you can describe the visual material at the top level of your application, and it will cascade down through all content pages, all navigation of your application. And then if you have a particular control that you want to opt out of material, then you just go back to that control. And on the control itself, you can say visual equals default. And it will then, from that point, take the platform default renderer as opposed to the material renderer. So a key part of the philosophy that I'm certainly driving for, and I hear from a lot of developers is when we take control and make decisions for you, that's very frustrating to you, right? Because then you got to work around something that you don't agree with. So in this case, and in all cases, we're trying to be very aware of putting control in your hands to choose how you need to make this work. And this is a great example of that. You can choose to use Visual however you need to, at the control level, at the page level, at the app level, and all in between. Visual is the first attempt or the first design paradigm that we're using. We can take this in other directions, and in the future, you could also end up providing your own visual style. Let's say that your company has a very unique visual style, or let's say, I don't know, BlackBerry suddenly comes out with their own visual style, or iOS changes something dramatically and introduces a whole new visual style that changes everything. We can now support that using this visual tag. So you couple the visual tag with the shell tag, and you suddenly have a much more unified application experience if that's your goal. Like I said, the feedback we're hearing is about 90% of projects, and it's not per developer. You as a developer might have one project where your goal is to have it the same on iOS and Android. You might have another project where you want it to be unique on iOS and Android. And then you might have another project where it's mostly the same, but particular controls, pickers, calendars, things like that are very platform specific. You want to make sure that they are still platform specific to get that feel. And I think that this is a huge advantage of Xamarin.Forms as a native mobile application platform for cross-platform mobile. I think it's a huge advantage over what you get from other cross-platform frameworks that you can think of the names.
I don't really like the word cross-platform in the Xamarin.Forms case, because I think when you're talking about cross-platform, you often think about that magic box that render same UI and you don't have access to the platform-specific things. So I used to say multi-platform instead, because it enables you to build apps easily for multiple platforms.
Absolutely. And multi-platform is a phrase that we tend to use a little less, but it certainly comes up a lot. And I think multi-platform for a lot of people, they start thinking beyond iOS and Android and mobile. They start thinking desktop, and they start thinking web. They start thinking HoloLens and Xbox and all that sort of thing, which of course you can do with Xamarin, which is fantastic. I almost wonder if we should start using omni-platform, right? It's like all of them, and the best of all worlds, really. Let's say in the future we introduced a Skia-based platform that draws everything similar to what Google is doing with Flutter, whatever the engine is to drive that. In the future, Visual and Shell, I think, positions us very well to be able to do that while keeping the control of how you want these things to happen in the developer's hands. You may not want every control in your application to be rendered with Skia. You may only want some of them to be rendered that way and the rest of them to be platform specific. We can do that. And so I think that's a huge advantage to choosing Xamarin over other platforms.
Yeah, I agree with you. But you say that you will have a material now. Will you add more out of the box in the stable release, or will you come with them later, or what's the plan right now?
Right. So the plan is to learn, right? So we want to get the stuff out there. We have some reasonable confidence from all the customer conversations we've had that material visual is going to solve a lot of needs. So once we get this out there and people start using it, we're going to be listening very closely and interviewing developers to find out if this needs to go other places. Do we need to add a Cupertino style where your Android app can look like an iOS app? Or do we need to adopt other themes, other different visual styles? So I think what you'll see a lot from us, and what you are seeing now, is that we release things, and these, Shell, Visual, Collection View, these are all really good examples that we feel meets the most need, that brings the most value, but it certainly isn't everything. And we're going to listen very closely to what the developer community says to us after we do that. So perfect example is Shell, Visual, Collection View. All these things that we're talking about right now are focused exclusively on iOS and Android. We haven't talked at all about UWP. I mentioned UWP earlier, but these controls and these new features do not currently work on UWP. Okay. So we need to hear from people. What does that mean for you? What's the value loss that you're having by not having UWP? Is that a significant number of developers that are using Xamarin.Forms? Or is this, hey, we're really only primarily using Xamarin.Forms for iPhones and Android devices, and UWP is a nice to have? We need to hear that. So we don't, it's not fun to hear people be upset and complain, but we need to hear it. That posture of learning that a program manager does, that's kind of the strategy that we have right now, because we need to make sure that we're focused on delivering the best experiences for the things that we are doing. And that means that we need to make some choices as to where we invest. So iOS and Android is the easy investment for us. We know that that's really the vast majority of what customers are doing with Xamarin. But UWP definitely is there. And we need to understand better from developers what this means to them, that these controls, at least in version 1, don't support UWP. That doesn't mean that they will never, but we just need to learn that from customers, if that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah, when we're talking about the platforms for Xamarin.Forms, what is the official platforms right now? It's a lot of talk about WPF and Mac and Tizen, and what platforms are you supporting?
Well, what does it mean for a platform to be official?
That you say that's official, and you're working with them.
I know. Everybody wants. I got an email just the other day. What's the official stance on such and such? And I'm like, It's an open source project. I think we're fairly clear on who owns and who maintains what, but there's a difference between what is official and what we are currently investing in, right? Like, so yeah, the official platforms that we support are iOS, Android, and UWP. WPF and Linux by GDK are community projects.
Okay.
Mac OS is official, but it's still in preview, and we're still learning how much people are using it, what they're using it for, and how much we should invest in it. And then Tizen is supported by Samsung, so it's an official product of Samsung. So yeah, I mean, but in terms of so that's the official, what we support and what we are responsible for. What customers are using and where we're investing our efforts and focus right now internally is iOS and Android. I think that's very clear from the work that you see us doing. That doesn't mean that we completely ignore a UWP issue if it comes in. When a Mac OS or a WPF issue comes in, if we can go ahead and merge it, we will certainly do that, or Linux for that matter. But we're not investing our own sprint times. When we do our sprint planning and everything, we're not planning a ton of time on that stuff. It just,
I think it's interesting from a point of if you want to contribute to Xamarin.Forms in some way. How many platforms do you need to think about? Because as you said, the most of the developers probably just using iOS and Android, but do they need to think to implement or at least have a plan how to do things on the Mac as well?
Yeah. Well, I think, if you look at it reasonably, and of course I was, 10 years my own company before I joined Microsoft. And when I look at this, I'm thinking about it in terms of it's an open source project. The maintainers of the project have been very open and welcoming to PRs to all these community pieces, whether it's WPF, GDK, Tizen, Mac OS. And so I look at that and I'm like, okay, well, they're not blocking progress on those platforms. So the community is there for it. And the community is driving it forward at a certain pace, maybe not the pace that iOS and Android are going, but it's there. So it's not dead, right? And so I, as a developer, can get confidence looking at that and say, okay, well, should I need to go to Mac OS or WPF or whatever? I have an option. And I know that if I need to PR something, I absolutely can do that. I know of customers. I saw a really cool app from Brazil that they're using Mac OS and WPF, and it's just crazy amazing. But of course, in order to achieve their multi-window needs and different things, they had to submit their own PRs, and they were happy to do so because they had that knowledge, that experience, et cetera. So, in the future, would we take a more active role in Mac OS, WPF, all those other backends? Absolutely, that's possible. But for today, the community is primarily driving those things, and I'm happy to say that they are. They're contributing. I saw a bunch of Mac OS contributions from a guy, I think he was in the Ukraine, and very cool to see that he's continuing to push that project forward. So, yeah, that's kind of how I think about it, and how we think about it. And those are some of the hard decisions we have to make. But just because we say today iOS and Android doesn't mean that that's a forever thing. That's just where we need to be invested today. And we continue to learn and evaluate and adjust.
Okay, that was a really good answer. Anything more do you want to add to the Xamarin.Forms future, or do you think we have covered the biggest things?
Yeah, those are definitely the big things. Is the one thing that I'll add is please, share with me, share with all the other program managers what you're working on. You may not want to, I don't know, maybe you're shy about talking about your project, or maybe you don't think it's ready to share and talk about. Doesn't matter. We need to hear all of it because it all helps to inform what we're doing and what we're building for you. Because if it's not helping you and not improving your life, or at least improving the majority of Xamarin.Forms developers' day-to-day lives, then we're working on the wrong stuff. and we need to know that. So please reach out to us, proactively share what you're working on. I had a gentleman direct message me on Twitter and say, hey, here's all the projects that I'm working on, and sent me a list of GitHub links. I love that. That's amazing. I had another guy last week send me an email linking me to all of his App Store and Google Play Store projects that he's worked on. It's just so helpful to be able to see concrete examples of what people are dealing with and what their challenges are, but also what your successes are. You never know, man. You might send us something, and we're doing the community stand-up now, first Thursday of every month on YouTube and Twitch. And we may feature your stuff if you allow us to. I know some stuff is NDA, and we're happy to protect NDAs, but please, share with us on GitHub, email us, tweet at us, because knowing what you're working on is so critical to understanding how we can help improve the product for you. And we love talking to you, mostly. So this has been great, Daniel. Man, I really appreciate you having me on. And I'm excited that you've got a podcast going, and you got a new book out. That's amazing. So excited to see that.
It was a lot of work, but I think we have great feedback so far on it. So it's really fun.
Cool. Yeah, I bought it. I downloaded it. I got it.
Okay, that's cool. I hope you will enjoy it, even if you know everything already.
There's always more to learn, man. Always more to learn.
Yeah, I mean, I think it could be interesting for you to see other approaches on Xamarin.Forms as well by reading other developers' books.
Yeah, absolutely. Always.
So, I only have one question for you.
Mm-hmm.
It's not related to Xamarin.Forms, but I think many people thinking about when they developing Xamarin.Forms, what IDE to use, primary Visual Studio for Mac or Visual Studio on a Windows machine. What's your primary choice?
Yeah, so I am personally most productive on Visual Studio for Mac. However, I spend most of my time on Visual Studio on Windows. And the reason I do that is because as a program manager, I need to understand what the majority of our users are experiencing. So I put myself in positions that I personally wouldn't have chosen. And, it's a wonderful IDE, and I actually enjoy Windows a lot more now than I used to. But day to day, if I'm choosing my IDE to use, I'm on a Mac. And I just find that I'm more productive there, probably because, when I was doing mobile development for 10 years, I was doing it all on a Mac. So that's just, my fingers know what to do when I'm on that platform.
And I think the biggest reason to go for Visual Studio for Mac is it's much more faster when you're developing iOS apps. You have faster deploy, faster build times. You don't have to struggle with the connection and things like that. So I'm really surprised that so many developers not using it.
Yeah,
even if they have a Mac, they don't use it running virtual machines.
There's a variety of reasons for that. I think if you have a history of working on Windows, in particular in Visual Studio, then you've got there's a lot of muscle memory. It's a lot of you've learned that IDE. It's part of you. It's almost like part of your being. And so to switch over to Mac, even if some of the things are smoother and you don't have remote connections and things like that, it can be a struggle that it's hard to get over. I know that just simple things like copying and pasting and things like that are just simple key combinations can really make you stumble and be less productive switching between platforms. But I agree. Hopefully in the future with, everything that we're working on in Visual Studio on Windows, it will be a much smoother, faster experience. I cannot stress enough that you need to keep a very close watch on the announcements as we approach Microsoft Build this year, in particular for Windows developers, but also for Mac developers. There's going to be some really amazing Xamarin announcements. That's all I'll say about that.
Okay, I hope you introduce CodeLens for Visual Studio for Mac. I think that's one of the things that I miss the most. So
interesting. Well, I'll let that team know.
Yeah, I think I have. I emailed them a couple of times with the suggestion for Visual Studio for Mac, so I think they know. And I'm probably not the only one that reaching out to them as well. So
cool.
Okay, thank you very, very much for joining me. And if you send me contact details, how to provide feedback for Xamarin.Forms, I will add them in the show notes.
Absolutely, I will do that.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Daniel.